Tonight, we'll be looking at one of the most important UFO documentaries ever made, Mirage Men. The 2013 film looks at government disinfo and psyops in the UFO field. At the center of the film is the disinfo campaign, frequently referred to as the Bennewitz Affair, and that operation's most infamous player, the now ex-special agent of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Richard Doty. We'll be breaking down that story and more on tonight's Mysterious Library.
And welcome to the Mysterious Library on the Untold Radio Network. Dean, before
Jason.
we get into this particular documentary, we have put the elves to bed. The orcs are fed. The popcorn has been popped. So before we dive into all this, how's your week been?
Busy. I've been, I had my daughter's homeschool group today, her community group. So Tuesday's always crazy. I'm up at like 5:40 in the morning and then getting ready, then off, then back, then getting ready for the show. But other than that, busy with my little side project, which I've told you about, which we'll reveal I think I'll reveal it on this show soonish. I think I'm about to start filming. So when it's going, I'll let people know. What about you? What you been up to?
Actually, much of the same, except not having to wake up at the butt crack of dawn. Although I stay up until the wee hours in the night. So you're the morning, you're the early bird. I'm the night owl. So
I'm a night owl by habit. Like before I had a child, I was that guy who stayed up all night working, and because I could set my own hours because I was self-employed. And then I'd be working till 5 or 6 in the morning, then getting up at noon. My hours were totally screwy. But now I have a little alarm clock that wakes me up early every day, so I can't do that work till 6 in the morning, or I'll get like an hour's sleep. So I've stopped doing the night owl ways, as much as I love them.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm more of a night owl anyway, but the world calls, sadly. Honestly, again, same here. Just busy working on these side projects and getting ready for doing the show, stuff like that. I have to admit, I should stop doing research before the show because we just talked about. We're not gonna say anything on this show, at least for now. But holy cow, I need to stop looking at things before the show because now my mind is reeling, and it's like I got to get back into the Mirage Men. I mean,
now everyone's going to want to know what you see. I mean, you could say the personality who put you onto it originally and not comment further than that. You could say
I am not even going to do that.
Okay.
I'm just just sadly. This is what's called the tease. It may pop up on a show somewhere at some point in the future is all I'm going to say. Until then, I got to get back into the mindset of this particular documentary because the elves were so nice to actually throw, like they didn't use the fake butter, they used like the real butter when they popped the popcorn this time. You know, so it's, and then they use that orange salt, right?
Mm-hmm.
That proper popcorn salt. I mean, they went through a few extra steps this time, so we should definitely talk about the Mirage Men.
Well, maybe they were disinfo elves. Maybe they were really government agents in suits trying to butter you up.
You see, I laid it down, and he picked it up. This is what I like about Dean. He's paying attention.
Yeah, that's what I'm paid the big bucks for. Pay attention to Jason.
Exactly.
But what a movie. I mean, Mirage Men is my favorite UFO documentary ever made. It's probably not my favorite documentary ever made, but it's up there. It's the most important UFO documentary I've ever seen, hands down.
I completely agree with you on that. I only found this like 5 years ago, I think. So I'm a little bit newer to it than I think probably you are. And I agree with you. Like, it's not the best documentary ever made from a technical standpoint, storytelling standpoint, but it is, I think, one of the most important UFO documentaries ever made, because it is addressing something that a lot of people in the UFO community don't want to talk about at all. And which is the role of military disinformation campaigns and governmental disinformation campaigns in the UFO community, and how so much of what we think of what gets talked about on a regular basis, just like in the same way that the Shaver mysteries and all of these, all these things play into the broader UFO narrative. Man, what the military has done with the information, with the the NSA has done, with the OSI's pulled, when you see just the tiny fraction of what they're talking about, man, this has to be a much bigger part of the conversation. If you want to actually have a real conversation about truth and fact, you have to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, when I was finishing my PhD in the mid-2000s, Greg Bishop's Project Beta had essentially just come out. At least it was the book that everybody was talking about. That was probably the most controversial book, or the most talked about book at the time. And Greg Bishop's book, Project Beta, really paves the way for Mirage Men. In fact, he's the main consultant and is one of the main people interviewed again and again in the documentary. And although I'd heard of the Bennewitz Affair, I think there'd been a story run over a couple issues in Fate magazine. I think Valet mentioned it in one of his books. It was Bishop's research which really kind of put the entire story, just laid it out there. And then just for people who, after they've heard this, whether they've seen Mirage Men or they watch Mirage Men after they've listened to the show, they might like to go away and pick up a couple of other books. Greg Bishop's It Defies Language it's not billed as a companion piece to Mirage Men, to Project Beta, but the first section of the book really is almost a continuation of much that he talks about in that. And of course, there's Mirage Men itself by Mark Pilkington, who's one of the Pilkington rather, who's one of the filmmakers. He wrote it, I believe. And more recently, Adam Go Rightly's book, Sources, Spooks and Kooks, looks at this type of stuff in some more detail as well. So I think all of those books, anybody who's interested in the UFO phenomenon should read. And to start with, if you haven't seen Mirage Men, watch Mirage Men, because as you were saying, Jason, it's one of those central, it talks about a story which is one of those central myth-making moments of UFO belief. Whether you believe in UFOs or not is irrelevant to the fact that we can trace so much of what I call always X-Files UFO belief, because everybody seems to know what that means. And that's pretty much normal UFO belief now. UFO crashes, underground bases with aliens and government, doing secret treaties together, mass abduction campaigns, all of this stuff really, you can trace it back to the Bennewitz Affair, the Majestic 12 document. So much of what we think of today, or what so many UFO believers take for granted as part of UFO history, when the Bennewitz Affair kicked off in the late 70s, this stuff wasn't. Now there was conspiracy and there was tales of some of these things, but it wasn't that extreme X-Files, I think Jerome Clark called it something else, like, I don't know, dark side ufology or something. But the point is, this very sinister X-Files type conspiracy, that stuff starts with Bennewitz. And for those who don't know what the Paul Bennewitz Affair is, I'll just fill people in very quickly. Paul Bennewitz was an electrical engineer who had his own quite successful electrical engineering company, and he lived, and I think he ran his home maybe out of there. He lived and maybe ran his business out of there. Anyway, whatever the point is that he was directly opposite Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he began to see essentially lights in the base, which he thought looked like UFOs. And then because he had all this high-tech equipment, because it's what he did, and he was able to pick up on these transmissions, which he also thought was extraterrestrial or related to extraterrestrials. And being a good patriot, Benowitz went to the base and said, I'm picking up this stuff and I'm seeing stuff on the base. I think it's ETs. What he'd really bumped into was a secret classified military technology, again, for lack of a better term. And what supposedly the AFOSI decided to do was to elaborate on his UFO belief and his interpretation of it to throw him off the real scent. And the story became more and more complicated, because then when Bennewitz started looking into it more, Doty took him to Dulce Mesa, which is a distance away, but where they wanted to kind of redirect him and said, there's a secret UFO base under here or some such. But then Bennewitz started, because I think Bennewitz was a pilot as well, he started doing his own flights over there, and happened to fly over when a genuine Air Force, I think like an aerial unmanned vehicle or unmanned aerial vehicle had crashed, took photos of it, and then took that to the base and said, I've seen a saucer that's crashed, not knowing, again, he was really capturing imagery of our own technology. And so then the AFOSI had to continue to spin and continue to spin. And the story gets even darker, and there's revelations by Go Rightly that I hadn't read before, that allegedly when the Air Force gave Benowitz supposedly a computer that could crack the ET code and was really just feeding him these weird messages which they'd programmed into it, Go Rightly suggests that that it was Hynek, the ex Project Blue Book science officer, and the most probably famous ufologist of the 20th century. He was actually the person, supposedly, who gave, or at least allegedly gave, Benowitz this dodgy computer. So then, and you start calling into, the story starts calling, I suppose, it starts questioning our faith in not only the UFO narrative, but the major ufologists. So Hynek's since been suggested as being involved. I don't know how true that is, but it's certainly mentioned in Go Rightly's book. William Moore is front and center in it. William Moore is the first person who writes he's the person who writes the first book on Roswell with Charles Berlitz, and Stanton Friedman does some of their research. And William Moore comes out in 1989 at the MUFON Symposium, which is the biggest UFO conference, or the most important UFO conference in the country. And this is covered in the movie as well. And says, I was essentially, without using the terminology, I was an asset for Richard Doty. I was reporting on to the government about what was happening in the UFO community. I was also feeding disinformation to the UFO community. And it's, of course, it's so William Moore popularizes Roswell. Mind you, supposedly he became an asset afterwards, but who knows? William Moore's also the guy who is partnered with Jamie Chandere, who receives the MJ12 documents in his mail. And so the MJ12 documents come out of this small group of people again. So we have all of the stuff around Dulce, all of the underground bases, potentially Roswell, because Moore wrote the first book on that, the MJ12 documents, and we see this incredible tapestry of modern UFO belief come out of these few players. Whether you want to believe it or not, whether it's true or not, you can see where this information gets interjected into what most people believe about UFOs. And it goes back to Richard Doty, William Moore, what happened to Bennewitz, what happened to Linda Moulton Howe, who Richard Doty, the AFOSI officer, also had a professional relationship with. I was going to say,
we don't want to allude something else.
No. But and he feeds her just quickly what's essentially the MJ12 documents before they're released. So Doty has them in his hand, lets her read them at the Air Force base, then takes them back off her. So we can see all of this belief comes from these very small group of people. It's just fascinating.
Well, and so in one of the things, just to take a step back to the Bennewitz affair, right? There's two parts of there's maybe a little bit of a nuance that I want to point out, because if I recall, he actually thought at the beginning that he was intercepting maybe Russian information or Russian, like he was worried that there was spying going on. He takes it to the Air Force, and they're like, they're aliens. So this wasn't, and I think the big point here is it wasn't Richard Doty's idea. Like, he was just the officer assigned to it. This was a fully approved, because when we say, oh, it's just a couple people, this was a fully approved operation by, again, according to the documentary, by the OSI, by the Air Force. And what's weird is the NSA gets involved at the same time, because that was one of those things where he's, Bennowitz's son contacts Richard Doty. He's like, I need you to stop this. You're terrorizing my father with the break-ins and all that. And he's like, whoa. That's not us. Turns out it was the NSA. So this is where things get really weird. To sum up, it is very clear that the United States government deliberately chose to drive this man crazy. I mean, you could argue that they were pushing buttons. Again, when you look at some of the other things that they've done, they were creating this story for him to follow. They were leading him on, and they were the ones who, like, they drove this man to insanity.
Well, that's definitely a legitimate interpretation. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly if you start thinking you're having contacts with ETs and have a computer which is giving you information, it's going to send you down a paranoid rabbit hole.
Right. But
I think,
if the government tells you, here's this secret laptop and it'll help you decode these messages, they're priming him to do this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they're telling him that this is what it is. So the problem is he's being told that's what it is. So again, not to speak over, but it's like, I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree with that position, but it's very clear if the government's telling you something, if you trust the government, this was a World War II veteran. And something they bring at the very end of the movie is they could have just told him.
Yeah, that's the weird thing. I think the problem with the story and where it gets complicated is, I'm sure if they told him, you've stumbled upon something that we don't want civilians to see, we're going to swear you to secrecy right now, make you sign the Official Secrets Act or something, I'm sure Bennewitz probably would have gone away and just let it alone. But for some reason, they decided to spin his UFO suspicions, because you're right, I think he did have foreign intelligence fears as well, but he was already a UFO believer. He already saw these weird lights which he thought looked like UFOs. So it didn't take him too much to push him in that direction. And regarding the NSA involvement, that's certainly possible as well. It's difficult to tell, though, because of the people who are telling you these stories,
right,
what actually really is going on. And was Richard Doty acting as somebody who was a conduit for information which had been channeled from higher up, and they wanted to spit out UFO disinformation as well as throw Bennewitz off the scent? Because don't forget, they gave Linda Moulton Howe very similar weird ET stuff, which was ultimately what the MJ12 documents were.
Yeah.
So they were, unless they decided it was so effective to play the UFO playing card, and they just kept doing it, or was it to interject this kind of belief into the broader UFO community? There are other questions as well, of course. How much was it?
Yeah.
How much of it was Richard Doty getting the documents from above to feed, and how much of it was, hey, this is my operation, I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to invent this UFO story?
Yeah.
Because Richard Doty's intelligence is always played down, including by Richard Doty. Like, I've spoken to Richard. I've had him on the old Talking Weird before we moved to the Untold Radio Network, where we are every Saturday night at 10 p.m. And Richard says, listen, I'd have to be a wonderful writer and a science fiction genius to write some of this stuff, as somebody else did in the documentary as well, who was talking about later the Project Serpo affair, which we'll get to. But I think Richard Doty is pretty canny. I think it wouldn't be inconceivable that he might have the skill set to write some of this stuff from scratch. I really don't know. So then it becomes a question of, was this a big elaborate plan? Was it just Richard Doty going, this is how I'm going to deal with these people? It's hard to be honest. I don't know. All I know is this information was fed to specific people in the UFO community, and now it's what most UFO believers believe, which is kind of frustrating, because even though this all came out in '89 in that symposium, the biggest UFO symposium in the world, and the UFO community were furious with William Moore for betraying them, It didn't make them stop and go, well, he's the guy with the MJ12 documents. He's the guy who wrote the Roswell book. He's the guy who was feeding all this Dulce underground stuff. They didn't step away and go, hey, everything we believe is nonsense. There was this moment of cognitive dissonance instead,
Yes.
where they just yelled at William Moore as a traitor, but kept believing
Everything
all
he
of the
said.
stuff, which became X-Files. This wasn't even as big as it was. It got bigger after 89. By the late 90s, by the millennium, after we'd been sucked in more by stories popularized in X-Files, everybody who believed in UFOs believed this stuff. But they forgot when they got so angry with the people who were manipulating them, Dodie and Moore, they forgot to go, well, maybe all the stuff we were fed is nonsense.
Yeah, no, that's really where, because when we get to the Project Serpo, there's one thing that happens after, again, concerning Dodie, that I really do want to touch on. But back to your point, there's a quote by Moulton Howe, which is that once you get into this, you realize it's a hall of broken mirrors with a quicksand floor, and she's 100% correct, because once you realize, yes, Richard Doty was disinformation, but back to your question of, is he smart enough to have pulled this off? The man was a member of OSI. Okay. He is trained in counterintelligence and disinformation. Hell yes, he is. Okay. They even catch him in the documentary in a lie with, again, I don't want to get too far into the Serpo stuff right now, but that he's very clearly the one feeding the Serpo information. Right.
Yeah, they tracked down his ISP address, and it's like, oh, he was the one feeding the main Serpo website guy all the information.
Exactly. Like, they catch him in the documentary saying, no, this is him. This is Richard Doty doing this, while he's saying on camera, no, it's not me.
That said, he still denies Serpo. Like, that's one thing I asked him about on the show. And he says, no, Serpo has nothing to do with me. But of course, I think the most interesting thing is he supposedly says it doesn't have anything to do with him, but he goes to the UFO conference to watch the guy talking about Serpo. Like, he's obviously fascinated with, is this story? And you almost have to think, he's like, is this story going to take off like the MJ12 documents took off? That other thing I pulled, 20 years ago. Is this going to go the same way?
Well, and so here, this is sort of the bigger point. Because your question is, was this just his way of handling it? Was there something more? Okay.
And sorry, just quickly, Richard Doty mightn't have written any of this stuff. I have no idea. I'm just guessing.
Right. Yeah.
And having fun with the idea. He might just have literally had a higher up hand him it, and they might have said, hand it over to Linda Moulton Howe, send this stuff to, to William Moore. And he might have gone, aye, sir, and done it. I don't know. I just have the suspicion that Doty is far cannier than he gives himself credit, and some other people give him credit for as well. That's my suspicion.
And here's my thing. I completely agree. In fact, I think the evidence, again, you don't get to be where he is in the position that he's in without being good at something, right? Like, he's not a stupid man to be doing what he did. Now, again, but he's a civilian now. He's telling the truth now. It's like, okay, maybe, right? There's the old saying, once you're, with the CIA, you never leave the CIA. Intelligence operations work that way. Now, again, for me, the big thing is, the question that you asked, and I do think the movie's very good, or the film is very good at this. You said, was this just him doing it, or was this from the higher ups? I absolutely think that this plan is from the higher ups. Like, I don't think Richard Doty could have done what he did and have the access that he was giving to people, the tours, the thing. He couldn't have done that just on his own. Like, they couldn't just be, this is my thought, let's do this, and have everyone be like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. There does seem to be, and again, a larger plan at play here, but he is a key pivotal character in this play. I think he was absolutely a primary point of disseminating and infiltration into the UFO community. He may even been the primary for the flow of information, but I don't think he came up with this on his own. This was something he was ordered to, because there's, again, Richard Doty isn't behind Project Blue Book, right?
No,
I mean,
no, he wasn't even in Air Force back then.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like this. A lot of this predates Doty, so he is operating under orders. However, to your point, I think he is much smarter than he's much more creative. He is much more intelligent. He's much more wily. Just to move beyond canny here, he's more wily then I think then he wants to portray himself, right? Because if he's a disinformation agent, he doesn't want to come out and be like, I am super smart and I lie a lot. That's why you should trust me. It's like, no, he's like, I'm just a simple guy. I was doing a simple job. I was just being Yeah, he probably had a way. Again, I think he did probably have a hand in creating all of this. He was involved highly. I'm right there with you on that. But I think he did. The order came down and he was doing his job.
True. What's fascinating, of course, is that we see Doty as, again, whether he's the conduit or the creator, or whether he's told, hey,
Or
hoax
both.
some UFO stuff. Yeah, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But we see him as that source between Linda Moulton Howe reading the MJ12 documents, Paul Bennewitz being fed, crazy things, his asset or a friend of his asset getting the MJ12 papers, which sound very much like what he'd already shown to Linda Moulton Howe. And now people suggest he was at the heart of the Serpo story. And whether that's true or not, he's Richard Doty, again, in fairness to him, I'll say what he said. He said, no, I had nothing to do with Serpo. He said, I think he said something like, I got on some bulletin boards and chatted about it. That documentary seems to make, that documentary implies or says Richard Doty was the person who was feeding the Serpo information. So if that is the case, then we can look at all of these. And Serpo never became as popular as MJ12 or as popular as the idea of alien bases under, the Dulce Mesa or any of this other stuff. But we can see Doty as somebody who was obviously, whether he was like, as again, somebody else implies he might have gone a little bit maverick. There's that other ex-AFOSI agent. What's his name?
You're right.
Walter Bosley is another ex-AFOSI guy who says a story. I was not really warned about Richard Doty, but I was told, he kind of didn't say he was a wild cannon, but he's, he does some, just be careful is kind of what he implied. So whether it was Richard just doing his job very well, it's interesting that we don't have any other AFOSI people that we can put, between ufology and the government as easily. I mean, you're right. Going back, you can start to talk about Hynek as Go Rightly does, and going back, you can look at Blue Book. But Blue Book seemed to be doing something very differently. Now, again, policy could have changed, but Blue Book was downplaying UFO reports. It wasn't. It wasn't, as far as we know, interacting with civilians and trying to get them to believe that there were secret UFO bases under the Dulce Mesa, or handing them documents which implied there was some elaborate government conspiracy going back to the 40s. Do you know what I mean? So while you can say there were aspects of previous operations done by the Air Force to downplay, or the CIA or any organization to downplay, and like in fact they start by talking about the Robertson panel, which said, this could be a threat to national security, so we need to downplay it and whatever else. But there's not really pre-Doty any wonderful smoking gun or gunman that you can point out and go, this guy fed all these people information. That's why Doty's such a fascinating, individual. And again, he's disliked by a lot of people in the UFO community. I like Richard Doty personally. He's never been anything but nice to me. But why I like to have had that opportunity to talk to him, he could still be feeding disinformation. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's his job. Maybe he still does. But when you talk to somebody like Richard Doty, as Greg Bishop says in the movie, at least you're talking to somebody who actually knows things. And so maybe they're feeding you 80% or 90% just garbage, but in there might be grains of truth being fed to you as well, because you're talking to somebody who knows. Most ufologists who've written a book, no matter how smart it sounds, what do they really know? They haven't been on the other side of the curtain,
Yeah. Well, and that's actually, so Kevin has sort of hit where I wanted to go with Richard Doty in general, which is, so for those who are listening, Kevin Morrison says Richard Doty could be fabricating the truth years later, and all is still misinformation. He later says it's all redirection, nothing is verified, and that's my point. There's a scene at the very end of the documentary where Richard Doty says that as part of the special projects, he was sat down with a group of other people, that he was shown films and footage and given a briefing on actual UFO crash sites, actual UFO, recovered bodies, living aliens, all that, right? And so it becomes sort of that question is, he says, look, the reason I came forward is I do think we need to, have a real, conversation about UFOs, that he's a true believer. He's there. He wants to actually help. Here's my problem. While I'm hearing him say this, and again, this is the context of the film at this point is Linda Moulton Howell asks the filmmakers, "Are y'all trying to just discredit that there's real UFOs?" He goes, "No." The filmmakers literally say, "We believe the UFO phenomena is real, but that this government misinformation and disinformation is designed to make it harder, so we don't actually know what the truth is." And so when I hear Richard Doty say these things, to your point, he's been on the other side of the curtain, but literally nothing he says can ever be trusted. So it's like he's saying, yes, I'm admitting to lying then, but I'm telling you the truth now. Here's the problem. You could be lying twice. You could have been lying then, and you can still be lying now because you're still selling a lie. Because this is on some, like you said, maybe it's not your job anymore, but it is. Maybe you just got really off on the project, and it worked really well, and you just like messing with, like, maybe you're just that kind of a person. There's 100 different reasons why he could still be lying.
Yeah. He could have been hired secretly by another agency afterwards that we don't even know. There's 100 reasons, or it could just be like you said, he enjoys it. And I mean, since that documentary, Richard has made even more astounding claims. Like even on the episode of Talking Weird, when again, before we were on the Untold Radio Network, he said that and I've seen him say it elsewhere, that he'd actually watched the interrogation of an extraterrestrial biological entity through like a security camera or a camera in another room. It was happening in the other room, but he was watching next door while this thing was being interviewed. He said that he was aware of extraterrestrial biological entities, well, robots resembling extraterrestrial biological entities being made to trick people. He said that he knows of government programs which abducted people and they pretended to be aliens, but it wasn't just to scare people or to make people believe about aliens. It was used as kind of this counterintelligence thing to get information out of people, because what better way to get somebody to tell you the truth when they think they're strapped to a table and being tortured by extraterrestrials. He said that when early on in his Air Force days, I believe he said he saw either an alien flying saucer or one we'd, rebuilt in a hangar. So he has lots of tales now that he's come out and said he experienced when he was in the Air Force. But again, I don't think it's just Richard Doty that you mightn't be able to trust. I think anybody who's been behind the curtain and comes out and says this stuff and isn't all of a sudden, disappeared, or maybe it's just because I'm suspicious and I don't think they'd let you say this stuff if they didn't want you to. Now, in fairness, Richard in that movie does say, I went to them and said I wanted to tell the truth, and they said, do what you got to do then. Like they didn't care if he went and told the truth. And who knows, maybe that's the truth. Maybe they thought this is just going to spin more crazy in the pot, or maybe counter what Linda Moulton Howe says, or to agree with what Linda Moulton Howe says, it might be all this fragmented hallway of mirrors with quicksand as the floor. But the truth is that there's no ETs visiting us. The truth is that this is some type of social control or something used to trick America's opposition overseas to make them think we have ETs, or it might be something to see how information is leaked to hostile parties internationally. It might be for 100 different reasons. And there might be no ET presence, or there might be no ET presence that the government is sure about. We can never know. The thing is, of course, UFO believers are going to say, well, they're using this to they're using it to, to make us look stupid, or they're using us as misdirection, or they're just feeding us some of the truth to prepare us for disclosure. And people who are more skeptical like me are going to say, well, if they lied about this, and this, that doesn't mean that the whole thing isn't a lie, So,
right. No, exactly. That, like you said, it's like there's so many options. The problem is it could be all of the above. Like there could be a real phenomena that they're aware of, but they don't have any direct contact with. And so they're like, well, why don't we use what's already there? Let's maximize it for our purposes, which can be psychological, psyops, social control, disinformation to enemies, distractions from the development of black projects, like the stealth bomber, like the SR-71, like all of these things. Again, I've been saying this for a long time. I read there was a popular science or mechanics, can't remember, my dad had from like the late 80s. I I read it in the 90s, and I've honestly believed this the entire time. I've long believed that what happened at Roswell was actually Operation Paperclip gone wrong. Heiser used that phrase. I would have never said it that way, but I think he's right. Because there's this article written in Popular Mechanics, again, very late 80s, about a guy who said, yeah, I was there. He was being interviewed, and he, long story short, he draws out the craft as more of a heel-shaped craft, and he has this cross hatching on it. He says, and so the guy who's interviewing him, who's entertaining this, says, "Oh, so are those heat tiles for the ship?" He goes, "No, it's to reflect the radar." Now, this is the late 80s. They had just sort of announced this. No, I'm sorry, it's the early 90s. Sorry, early 90s. So the F-117, the B-1 had just come out. So that's what everyone was thinking radar reflection was. But they had already announced the F-22 was in development and that they were going to be using this kind of technology where it would scatter through a pattern instead of these weird shapes like we see on the F-117A. And so it's like, this really makes a lot of sense that the UFO phenomena would be used to cover up these things. Again, you have all of these crashes that are occurring all over the American Southwest and West in the late 40s, early 50s, and into the 60s. Well, guys, yeah, that makes the most sense that we're testing out all this new technology that we got from World War II, because the Germans were coming up with some wild stuff. Here, where I live, I've seen it with my own eyes. One of the original flying wings that Northrop Grumman was developing post-World War II, we have it here in Fort Worth. I'm in Waxahachie, but they have an air, and it's there. You can see it. They've been developing these things for a long time. The thing about flying wings is they're very, very stable craft, right? But for you to get the design that you want that allows you to really hide from radar, like the F-117A, it took a lot of technology to get us to that point, because you have to have a computer system to fly it. It was nicknamed the Wobbly Goblin because it was just the pattern on it is so weird. It flies very strange. So that was the number one obstacle we had in developing the F-117, was that it doesn't want to fly because it's not the flying wing that's the problem. It's the weird angular design of it. It creates these weird eddies. So it makes a lot more sense that that's what's going on. They're using the UFO thing. But to your point, and let's getting back more to the story here. The NSA, OSI, the United States government was using Richard Doty and others to manipulate the UFO community for their purposes. And like we said at the very sort of the beginning, and they mentioned at the end, when it comes to Benowitz, they could have just said, "Dude, you're seeing some stuff. We're experimenting with some stuff. We know you're a patriot. That's why you came to us, so we can trust you. We're not going to tell you what it is, but we need you to stop because this is us. Please, we are trying to keep this secret." But they didn't. Like you said, this guy Benowitz would have agreed. He was a patriot. He's a veteran. He would have done it, but they chose to manipulate him. And again, it's like, can we trust it when Richard Doty says that he's like, "Hey, look, as a friend," because he's like, "I liked Benowitz. He was a good guy." And I was like, maybe you need to walk away from all this. Here's the problem. I can't trust that Doty did that. I'd like to think he did, right? I'd like to think that he was the kind of person who would say, "Look, I'm doing my job, but I don't like what we're doing to you. You're a good guy. This isn't fun. This is hurting you as a human being. And I want to make certain, I would like to help stop that." I don't know that I can trust someone who was doing that to him, that this isn't just him lying to us to cover up his complicity, to sort of soften his images. Like, look, because again, what do we say? His images, "I'm just a good guy. I was following orders. I was doing my job. We were professional, but I'm not smart enough to do this." Yeah, no. You're where you are because you are smart enough to pull that off, which also means you're callous enough to pull that off. That's my problem. And
Yeah.
so,
Sorry, go.
yeah, no. It's just, for me, the number one takeaway here is, again, outside of the UFO stuff, which we're going to continue talking about, the United States government deliberately chose to drive people insane and to manipulate the UFO community for their own purposes, whatever those purposes are. That should be the number one red flag in this entire thing.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, another way to, there's so many different angles to look at this. Another thing is the Bennewitz Affair took place, what, like 40 years ago now, right, or more?
Yeah.
Doty now seems like a genuine conservative, ex-military patriot good guy. And I do think he is. I get that impression from Richard Doty. That doesn't mean that he hasn't continued to maybe work for some kind of agency. It also doesn't mean that when he was 40 years younger, all gung-ho, this guy's looking in at the base and getting our secrets. I'll do what I have to do to throw him off.
Right.
You know, there's one, it might even be the other AFOSI agent we talked about. I can't remember if it's Bishop or if it's Walter Bosley in the documentary. It's a voiceover of a scene anyway. Says that they essentially, Doty and whoever else was involved in the project, they had to defend the secrets of the base, and they did what they had to do, and what they did worked. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we as people who are libertarian and conservative leaning, you and I, don't like the government doing those kind of things. And so I always have to force myself from getting really amped up about it, because obviously the government shouldn't be doing those kind of things to citizens. Now, that said, if you're in the military during the Cold War in the late 70s, and there seems to be a secret about to get out from the base, maybe it's you and a few guys that have to work out how to throw Benowitz off. If that's all it is, maybe you come up with a stupid plan, which is harmful. You know what I mean? We don't know how far up that command went. It might have been, okay, you guys, you're the people who are authorized, and it's your job to deal with this threat to base security. And a couple of, hot-headed 20-year-olds, early 30-year-olds, whatever they were, went, hey, we're going to play this UFO game. And you can see guys that age going, this sounds like a great idea. And that doesn't mean there isn't malfeasance there or something which is unconstitutional, but you can see guys doing that in defense of what they think is flag and country. It's not that big a stretch. No. Here's the one thing there where I spin more then. Then I wonder, because a part of me wants to go, well, that's an easy explanation for the Benowitz thing. Not a good one, but an easy one. But then you go, but what about the MJ12 documents? What was that all about? What was the Linda Moulton House stuff all about? Was it because it worked with Benowitz, so we thought how wider we could throw this? Or was there something more complicated going on? I suspect there might have been something more complicated going on. But again, this, as you said, the wonderful quote about this hallway of fractured mirrors and quicksand. I don't think there's an ET underneath that quicksand ready to gobble me up. But I do know that whatever conclusion I come to it's just me guessing at best.
Yeah. Well, if it was the Mysterious Library, I would suggest it was actually an Oompa Loompa, but I was waiting to eat you. But yeah, so I wanted to preface one thing, because you're right. I completely agree with, could it have just been them? You have a couple 20, maybe mid-20s, because I mean, this wouldn't have been handed to a rookie, right, to handle. But you're right. Could we see maybe again, to stuff we've talked about, maybe they were aware of the Shaver mysteries. Maybe they were fans of the pulp stuff they had, and so like, well, hey, why don't we just steal a bunch of these ideas from here, we'll repackage them, because like you said, I think it's a really valid point. Like, this could have been maybe less sinister in its origin. I mean, we do have to give it that. Again, I don't know Richard Doty personally. I've never spoken with him, and I'm not even here to say necessarily that I think that he is necessarily this evil, manipulative person, right? He clearly did his job. So yes, he is. I don't buy I'm not smart enough to pull this off, because if you're there, you are. Now, I don't know. Maybe he is. Maybe he's telling. Maybe everything he is saying is the God's honest truth from his perspective, right? And again, I want to put the quotation marks in his perspective, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I can't know that. What I can know is what he's admitted to, which makes the most sense, which is that he was an intelligence operations. He was, he acted as a disinformation agent because he was ordered by the government to do so. To your point, Benowitz could have been a mistake, right? He could have. Great. I'll give you that. But to your point, what about the MJ12 documents? What about Linda Moulton Howe?
What about
more is where I'm going. This feels like, on the very low end, this was a bigger operation than just Doty. Again, the NSA got involved, right? That's one of the things that keeps popping up is it's not just him, and that there are these other options as far as what was happening. The cattle mutilation thing, right? The explanation they throw in there, it's like, hey, what if it's actually this? Again, when you hear it spoken about, you're like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, it's a scary amount of sense, because you don't want to necessarily tip people off that, hey, you know what, we're trying in an early event at fracking, we used a nuclear weapon underground, but we think unfortunately may have irradiated some things, and they're surreptitiously mutilating cattle to test things, but they don't want to raise suspicions. So again, it becomes UFOs, right? That's the claim, is that they've doctored these special helicopters up to look like UFOs, so they can do what they're doing and not raise suspicions that, hey, maybe the government's running around trying to check on these cattle. Because it would, at some point, people would start asking, why is the government just randomly buying 2 head of cattle from each rancher in an area? Like, that would raise some suspicions, right? It would be one thing that if the base is like, hey, we need to buy some cattle, so we're going to buy it from this, like, we'll buy 100 head of cattle from this guy, or 10 head of cattle from this guy. That would make sense. But 2 from everybody, that would be weird. But if all of a sudden, hey, we're having these weird cattle mutilations, and everyone's like, I saw a UFO, boom. You no longer have to have people saying, well, maybe the government's checking on something. What could they be checking on? Oh, is it the fact that they irradiated our friggin' groundwater 30 years ago, and they're trying to see if they've poisoned us in our food supply? The answer is, by the way, yes to that, but that's a different story. So again, this documentary is really, really important because it gives you some different ideas and says, maybe a lot of these things that people in the UFO community take for granted is almost very likely misinformation, deliberately presented by Richard Doty and some of these other people.
I think we have to remember too, and it was a point you started to make earlier, and then we kind of got away from it, that maybe the government don't know anything, right? And about the UFO phenomenon, or not as much as we think they do. And that was certainly Jacques Vallée's point, perhaps the greatest living ufologist today, certainly one of the ones I respect most. That was his point up until his most recent book, Trinity, the Best Kept Secret. Up until then, he thought all of this crash story and secret government alien treaties and, Roswell stuff, he thought all of it was just nonsense. And he made a very convincing point of why it was nonsense, and why it seemed that the government mightn't know any more than they actually seem to, which is supposedly nothing unless you start listening to the MJ12 type, to stories. Now, of course, Vallée's changed that tune a little bit after writing the new book, which is about a pre-Roswell, proto-Roswell type crash, which I think is his most inferior book, as far as it's less convincing than any of the good Roswell books. I don't believe there was an ET crash at Roswell, as everybody who listens to this or Talking Weird knows. I think something happened there, as you were saying before, maybe an Operation Paperclip, maybe something else. But I don't think there was an ET crash. But Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, is far less convincing than a book by Kevin Randall or Don Schmidt. Those guys write great books. Or even the original book we were talking about, the original, what is it? Is it Incident at Roswell? Whatever the first one's called, by William Moore and Charles Berlitz. So I still tend to side with Vallée's older perspective, which is the government might know far less about any type of extraterrestrial interactions than we think. That doesn't mean they don't spin it. That doesn't mean they don't have amazing technology, and it works for them to use the UFO story to cover it. We know, as you said before, things like stealth could be covered with UFO tales. We know in the 1960s, the CIA was happy to use UFO stories and spin UFO stories to cover secret testings of things like the U-2, because the CIA's own historian has written a paper saying, we were happy to cover it, and we figured about 60% of UFO reports were secret craft like the U-2 being tested. So we know it's been done. But for some reason, and again, this is all speculation. Maybe we are being visited by ETs. I don't think that we are. But for me, having all this evidence of the type of spin by Doty, that CIA paper I was talking about, William Moore confessing to, this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And when we can trace so much of these beliefs to people we know were disinformation agents, then to walk away and have any modicum of that X-Files type UFO belief left, I don't want to insult anybody listening, but if anybody still believes that, you really have to check where all of that information come from. Where did that belief originate? And when you see where that belief originated, are you still comfortable to hold on to those type of beliefs?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that does come up again, and again, and Doty himself says it, so it does call it into question. But I think it's true. Everything we know about psyops, right? It's not like this isn't not publicly talked about. You always wrap the lies in a truth, right? So he'll even say, look, we're feeding you a lot of misinformation, but like there's 10, 20, 30, 40% of this that's absolutely true. In everything he said, he goes, even when he claims I didn't have anything to do with this, right? But he'll say, but there was some stuff in there that I knew was true from from the other things I was working on. So it's entirely possible that, maybe there is something. Again, I think that there's something to the UFO phenomena. I just don't think it's necessarily ETs. But the point is, there may be some things out there that are true and they give you the truth, but the lie is this part here, right? And so the lie is what because like any good magician, the lie is to get you to go off in this direction and make you think in these terms, right? I've talked about this before, but it's one of my favorite examples. David Copperfield, right? When he made the Statue of Liberty very famously disappear, they have, it's like there's this, you can see the Statue of Liberty. They're in New York Harbor and they're on a platform and there's a live studio audience there. He draws the covers, they move it over, and then he says his magic words, pulls the things, boom, everyone's, oh no, because it's not there. Draws the things, moves, and then all of a sudden it's like, does the magic words, it comes back, and everyone cheers. It's like, well, there must be, and people are like, there must be mirrors, there must be some elaborate rig to make this happen because he fooled the people in the audience. No, he didn't fool the people in the audience. They were in on it. All they did was move the platform was on rails. They just moved it a few feet so the camera position would change. And so the Statue of Liberty is no longer in frame. That's all they had to do. But they give you, the truth is, yes, it's a magic trick. It's an illusion. The trick is to make you think in this direction so you can't figure out how they fooled you, right? The best magicians do that. They give you a truth, but then they wrap that truth in a lie so that you never figure out what's really happening. And that seems to be the entire thing that Mirage Men do. Again, which is it's the name from the book. It's that these people create mirages. There's truth to what they are saying or wouldn't sell. There's truth here. There are facts here that are incontrovertible, but they're wrapped in these lies that we can't. And so the problem is those lies get us thinking in this direction. So we never stop to say, hold up, maybe it's this thing over here. Maybe the cattle mutilation aren't ETs. Maybe it is the government, and maybe it's not because they have necessarily sinister intentions. It's simply they're trying to CYA. Maybe there are UFOs. Again, we don't know. Maybe they have recovered some down stuff and they are playing with it. But maybe they're using the UFO stuff to hide, again, during the Cold War, all of our advanced technology that we were developing post World War II, both from Operation Paperclip and from this down stuff. Or maybe there was never any downed UFO stuff. There is a phenomena and they're aware of it, but like, well, we can't do anything with it. Let's use it since it's already popular anyway. Let's use it to manipulate people, to hide technology, to do whatever it is they want to do, right? This documentary is important because it says this is what's happening. We need to recognize that it's happening. Otherwise, we're going to keep missing the obvious trick. We're going to be looking at the attractive assistant instead of realizing that it's a fake, that you're on a fake platform.
Yeah, absolutely. This documentary is a great entry point for anybody who isn't
Mhm.
cognizant of how much of modern popular UFO belief spun out of a number of AFOSI operations and similar intelligence shenanigans in the late 70s into the 80s. So whatever your beliefs on UFOs, I can't recommend watching Mirage Men enough. And again, as Jason said, and the film says the same thing. This doesn't mean that there isn't a phenomenon. It just means we have to be very careful of what we believe when we can trace the roots of that belief to sources that were probably intentionally deceiving us.
Yes. No, I couldn't say any better. Again, if you're like, if you can't find it, like I can't remember all the places it's on right now, go to Tubi, Tubi. It's free with ads. I've seen it on Netflix. I don't have Netflix at the moment. But like you can go see it on Tubi for free.
It's free on YouTube too.
Yeah, it's free on YouTube. So there you go. Watch this documentary. You don't have to brave the depths of the Mysterious Library like we do. You can go watch it on your phone, right? Or as I'm plugged in there, you can watch it on your phone. You know, you can watch it on your laptop that you're watching this on. But go watch it. There are very few times when we're going to say you have to do, like, this is really important to do. This is absolutely one of them. Again, Joshua Cutchins is another one with Ecology of Souls, because we have to start thinking about these things maybe differently if we're going to get at a truth, if we're going to really understand what's going on in the world that we live in. This is one of those films that needs to be, that you need to watch.
Well, I think our final assessment is both of us give this movie 2 thumbs up.
Yeah.
If we were Siskel and Ebert back in the day.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
What are our plans for next week's a special Christmas episode, I think?
Yes, right? We have a special. Yes, we're going to. Okay. So it's an article, technically, probably a couple of articles about the rediscovery or the possible discovery of the actual tomb of the St. Nicholas. And mostly it's just an excuse to talk about St. Nicholas and have a good time, you know. But yeah, but yes, no, they think they may have found the tomb. And one of the reasons it stood out as an exciting, sort of interesting story is I didn't realize somebody stole his body. They stole because, yeah.
Or did they? I think he's in the North Pole. I don't think anybody stole it. I think he's there right now prepping for this year's Christmas, my friend.
You see what I have to put up with every week with this guy here? You see what I put up with? I put up with it for you. All y'all in chat, all y'all watching on replay, all y'all listening. And I put up with it for you because you're great people. Best audience. Good people out there. That's true. So next week we're gonna be talking a little Saint Nicholas, the real one, the one who's here to chew bubblegum and pimp slap heretics, and he's all out of bubblegum.
And fill up our stockings this Christmas Eve, right?
Yes. With tangerines and coal.
Well, hopefully they can leave the coal. I've been a good boy this year. Just give me the tangerines, Nick. It's a good question. Probably not. No.
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah. Yeah. I think we've broken a few hearts on this channel already. So probably.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, thank y'all for tuning in to this insanity. We love every single one of y'all. Next week's going to be a lot of fun. It's we're getting ready for the holiday season, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So we will catch y'all behind the Coward Catalog.
Thank you.